So I prepared just like few slides to sort of introduce the idea behind this workshop. So we what we noticed and we ourselves in my lab were or are a bit part of it right now is the big search of psycholinguistic data sets. So like relatively recently, people started to build data sets which can be quite different, but basically are relatively big and can be used for psycholinguistic research. So to give you like an idea, we have, for example, concreteness ratings for 40,000 words. We have sensory motor experience data sets. We have word prevalence data sets. Assume that you know most of the stuff, or at least some. We have iconicity, age of acquisition, and so data sets. We have even humor norms. We have survival-related dimensions, which are norm, and so on. Motivation ratings for motivation, for example. And it's also important that these norms or these data sets basically are not only related to English. There are many current projects which focus on other languages than English, or even relatively small languages. So this is something what we thought is good to sort of capture or focus on, maybe more broadly, and therefore we thought it might be interesting to this workshop today. Invite very interesting keynote speakers who will introduce their projects, and maybe also discuss future collaboration, because what we find very important nowadays is to do cross-linguistic stuff. So, for example, to collect similar things in more languages and then have more sort of deeper idea about how languages actually work. Okay, so this is all from me for the start. We are really glad that you came here. We hope that you will enjoy it. AMLaP, as the main event will start tomorrow, we will have a proper opening for that. Yeah, let's begin with the talks. So now it is my big pleasure to invite Pexman here, and I assume that most of you know Penny because she's a sort of important figure in the field. And today she will talk about lexical-semantic space. Okay, the floor is yours. I will try to shift it. Or yeah.
Hello. Good morning. It's great to be here, and I'm very excited. I was excited when Jan first contacted me about this workshop because this is obviously work that we've been doing for a while. We've been engaged in developing some norms for both behavior, but also for different dimensions of lexical-semantic features and aspects of meaning. And so it's a big pleasure to be here today. And what I want to do is walk through some of the work that we have done. I want to start with kind of the theoretical framing, but what I hope you see as we go through it is what has been made possible by the open availability of large sets of norms and what that has enabled in terms of theoretical insights. And by the end, we will be mapping lexical-semantic space, I promise. So I want to begin with an example of a study that I think is really elegant and really important. And it's a study by Linda Smith and colleagues from about 10 years ago now, But the reason I think it's really important is because it gets at something that most of my analyses will not be able to do, and it gets at causal inferences. So this is a study with toddlers and a caregiver. They came to the lab. The toddler was wearing a tiny GoPro on their forehead so that they could track, so the researchers could track their eye gaze and also their reaching behavior and their grasping behavior. And the toddler sat across from a caregiver. The caregiver labeled some novel objects that were in the space between the two people, the toddler and the adult. And so there was labeling happening. There was sensory motor interaction happening on the part of the child and the caregiver. And then, so they had this learning episode where they could be encoding the names of these objects while they interacted with them or while they were on the table in front of them. Later, the children's vocabulary was tested, so they could tell which which labels children had actually learned from this specific episode. And what they found, and you can see on in this figure on the left side, you've got data for trials where the child successfully learned the label. And on the right side, you've got data for trials where the child did not successfully learn the label. And the difference in terms of their eye tracking behavior suggests that for the things that the children learned the labels for, the interaction was very much focal. So there was a lot of focal exposure to the object, presumably because the child was mostly holding that object. And so what this study allows is a direct causal inference that sensory motor experience the child had led to learning of the label for this new concept. And that connection between sensory motor experience and label learning that we see in childhood, this seems to be one of the main mechanisms that children have to learn labels and learn the objects that those labels refer to. And this kind of data point is fuel for a large debate that's been happening in lexical processing and semantic processing. And the debate is, okay, if a child learns this way, that's great, but what happens in adulthood? So by the time you are an adult learning about, you continue to learn new names for things, new words, how does that learning happen? And so there is a whole continuum. This is the debate that I referred to. So this was our attempt a couple of years ago to capture the framework, the theoretical framework, the theoretical space that we're going to be navigating in the first few experiments I tell you about today. So this is what we call the continuum of embodiment. On the left side, you have the perspective that we called unembodied, or that people sometimes call the traditional symbolic model. And on the right side, you've got the strongly embodied view. And so this is describing what that relationship is between sensory motor processing and meaning. And so if you take the position on the right side, the strongly embodied side, you would say, well, meaning is constituted in sensory motor experience. I mean, this continues to be, we know it's important for the infant, but it continues to be the central way that we make sense of the world, that we learn about things, and that we, most importantly, represent things as we are processing them, even when the reference is not actually in front of us. So that's the strongly embodied view. It says basically, meaning is constituted in sensory motor states. You might reenact them later if the object is not actually in front of you and instead you're processing a string, but it's always about sensory motor experience. That's what grounds the meanings of things in the world. And then on the left side, you would say, well, actually, it's all about symbol manipulation. So we don't really constitute meaning in sensory motor states. Instead, we constitute meaning in symbols that we can manipulate. And then importantly, there's this whole middle ground, and that's the space that we're going to be navigating today. So the middle ground is where you'd find most theorists in current writing. And we'd call that something like a weakly embodied view. So this is the idea that while some concepts are grounded in sensory motor information, other concepts are grounded in other ways. So it could be language experience. That's probably the most important alternative that's been offered to sensory motor grounding. But there also increasingly are other sources of information that are being proposed to be important. And we're going to talk a lot about that as we go. Okay, so this is the theoretical framing for the theories that we're going to talk about today. And if we think about that framing and we think about lexical semantics, we can derive some specific hypotheses that we can test. And so when I first started thinking about embodiment and embodied cognition over a decade ago, I was working in lexical-semantic tasks. And so I thought, well, what would an embodied view predict about, say, visual word recognition or semantic decision-making in an adult? And there were two things that were important to the predictions that were derived. So the first prediction is this idea that even if I am not actually looking at the object in front of me, and instead I'm processing a string in a simple, fairly shallow lexical semantic task, I am still, according to a strongly embodied view, accessing sensory motor states that were important to my previous exposure to that referent as I process the word. So in order to come up with the meaning of the word and make a simple decision about it, I have to actually simulate some of the sensory motor information that was important to my previous experiences. So that sensory motor experience, sensory motor history is invoked even when you are just looking at the word. So it's kind of an offline situation. You're not looking at the object, you're just looking at the word. So offline simulation is one piece of an embodied theoretical prediction. The other piece for lexical semantic processing is this general phenomenon that typically more is better. And what I mean by that is if a word has more images associated with it, more semantic features, more associates, in general, all else being equal, processing will be facilitated. So words that are are rich in sensory motor information, words that are rich in imagistic information, words that are rich in language history, maybe through something like semantic diversity, they would all be privileged in lexical semantic processing because they have more stuff, more semantic stuff. So if you take those two things together, what you get is the prediction that, okay, words that are sensory motorly rich, so words that have more sensory richness, words that have richer sensory motor histories should be privileged, should encourage faster, perhaps more accurate processing in lexical semantic tasks. So that's the prediction that we set out to test. But what we needed was a way to capture word sensory motor histories. And so that was the inception of the body object interaction dimension. So we were trying to think of a way to capture how easily, so not necessarily frequency of exposure, because we would control for frequency, but how easily can the human body interact with a word's referent? That was the dimension we were trying to capture. And it was really about motor. So we already had imageability, which is a dimension that refers to how easily sensory imagery is evoked by a word's meaning. But this was about that physical interaction, the tactile motor interaction. And so to get an index of that experience, we asked participants to rate words. There have now been thousands of words rated for body-object interaction. And what we found was there was this reliable dimension. So people would reliably say, well, lightning, low body-object interaction, because the human body should not interact with lightning. In the middle of the scale, you get moderate ratings for things like wreath and ship, because they're very concrete, but they don't afford easy sensory motor interaction. Ships, because they're just too big, right? So it's hard for the body to physically interact with a ship, even though it's a very concrete, highly imageable thing. And then ball was one of the words they got the highest ratings. And I should say, although our ratings have been collected in English and all the work today I'm going to show you is in English, there are now BOI values available for other languages. So it's great that we found reliable ratings. People would consistently make similar distinctions about the sensory motor histories of these words' meanings. But the most important question for us, and the question that would allow us to test those predictions that I was telling you about to start today, is does it matter for behavior? So does it matter for lexical semantic processing? Because if it does, it suggests that this dimension of sensory motor experience is important for how it is that we organize meaning in the mind. So we have now tested, and other people have tested for behavioral effects of body-object interaction, or BOI, in many, many studies. I wanted to give you a few sample findings today, just to kind of give you a sense of how those predictions have been borne out with the BOI variable. So these are actually data for acquisition, and I wanted to show you this because I started with the Linda Smith example. So think about the toddlers and their tiny GoPros and the sensory motor experience they were getting, which was facilitating their language learning and their label learning. So what this graph shows you is the relationship between body-object interaction, but in particular, in this 2022 study, we actually collected specific body-object interaction ratings for children to try and get at some of those acquisition questions about the way sensory motor experience was related to acquisition. So these were ratings, so they're very much like our generic body-object interaction ratings, but they are from the perspective of a child. So the rater assesses how easily could a child interact with the words referenced. So the ratings are highly correlated with those for adult experience, but a little bit different because children have different bodies and different opportunities to interact with objects. So cigar, for example, cigar was a word that's relatively high in adult BOI and low in child. So, which is appropriate. So what this is showing you is that, as Linda Smith found, when we look at the whole, at a set of thousands of words, we find the same basic pattern, which is words for which children have easy sensory motor interaction tend to have earlier acquisition. So confirming that relationship. Okay. But what about lexical-semantic processing? Well, this is the data from the very first time we tested for a behavioral effect of BOI. And at the time, we and most other people were looking at between-item comparisons. So this is what we used to do. We choose a set of low BOI words, a set of high BOI words based on those ratings, and then we would match them on everything else we could think of. So age of acquisition, concreteness, frequency, familiarity, length, and so on and so on and so on. So there's always more things to match on, but dozens of things were matched. And what we found in lexical decision, which is kind of the gold standard lexical processing task, in lexical decision, we found that responses, so those word judgments, were facilitated for high BOI words more than low BOI words. We didn't find any difference in terms of accuracy, but accuracy was very, very good. We were kind of at ceiling, I think. And so what this suggests, this 35 millisecond effect, which was significant in this first study, suggested, okay, maybe there is something here. So if this dimension is important behaviorally, it suggests it's probably also important in terms of the way that we represent meaning in the mind. So an interesting clue. But there are all kinds of issues with this first study. One issue is that it's a lexical decision task. And as I'll show you, lexical decision is a good kind of conservative estimate of what matters for behavior, but it's super conservative when it comes to semantics. So for processing meaning, only about 2 to 5% of the variance in lexical decision can be explained by semantic variables. Most of it is explained by frequency and length and age of acquisition. So if we want to start looking at the effects of, say, multiple semantic variables, to give you a little bit of a preview of where I'm going, you don't have much variance to play with. So limited insights from a lexical decision task. The other issue that was raised pretty quickly by some reviewers was, well, in lexical decision, you're pushing buttons and you're looking for an effect of motor fluency in a way. So you're looking for this effect of sensory motor experience. So maybe all you're seeing is kind of like a response congruency effect, because your response is a motor response. Some of your items are more rich in terms of motor information. Well, to avoid that, here's a different test of a BOI effect in lexical-semantic processing. So this is an eye tracking study of sentence reading. So we have adult participants reading sentences. We have embedded within the sentence frames a low BOI word or a high BOI word. So I've got a couple of examples here of the kinds of sentences we presented. So Judith saw the reflection of the sun or cat, depending on the particular version the participant got, in the oval mirror. And so we had pre-tested these sentences, and we knew that sun and cat were equally predictable from the sentence frame, but sun is a low BOI word and cat is a high BOI word. So cat is the sensory motor, has more sensory motor richness than sun does. And then purse is high BOI and frost is low. So there's lots of things you can measure in an eye tracking study, as you know, but I've pulled out a couple of particular aspects of behavior to show you today. One is total fixation duration, and you can see that for those high BOI words, and again, it's just, again, a comparison of one set of words to another, matched on everything else we can think of. And so high BOI words indeed did have shorter fixation durations than low BOI words, suggesting more rapid access of meaning, more rapid integration. And similarly, there were fewer regressions back to high BOI targets than low BOI targets. So suggesting, even though we're not making a button pushing response in this task, the motor behavior is just eye gaze as they track for comprehension, you still see an advantage for words that have more sensory-motor richness. Okay, so the prediction we had based on those theories was that, okay, if sensory-motor information is important to how we understand, represent, acquire word meaning, then we should see an advantage in lexical-semantic tasks for those words that have richer sensory-motor histories. And that's what we found. So we and others have generally found body-object interaction facilitation in lexical-semantic processing. So this does seem to be a dimension of meaning that's important. But it's only one dimension. And so in some ways, you could take the results from the BOI studies and say, well, looks you could be talking about strong embodiment here, right? So you've got pretty substantial effects in lexical-semantic terms of sensory-motor information. But to really test on that framework, that continuum that we started with today, we need to assess whether other variables also matter at the same time, other semantic variables. Because the proposal, if you look at the middle of this continuum, is there's actually multiple dimensions of meaning, right? So yes, sensory-motor information is important, perhaps particularly for some kinds of concepts, but so is other kinds of meaning information. So how do we know it's really all about, so is it all about sensory-motor information, or is that just showing up because it's one of many dimensions that could predict behavior? So let's test that idea. So I wanted to give you an example of a study where we first tested this idea about simultaneous semantic richness effects and perhaps demonstrating that there are multiple semantic dimensions that simultaneously influence behavior. And so I thought I would pick a study that I think never got the attention that it deserved, because I can. So this is a study that was published in Cognition about 10 years ago. It was the doctoral dissertation of Ian Hargraves, who is now like the AI czar of the province in Canada that I worked in for a long time, Alberta. So Ian's study was trying to get at some of this idea of multiple semantic dimensions. So can we see multiple aspects of meaning simultaneously influencing behavior? If we can, it suggests that we're not talking simply about a strongly embodied view, because other aspects of meaning also need to be considered. And the way he did that was he put multiple semantic predictors, as I'll show you. So he had in his data set, and this still wasn't like a large data set, but there were hundreds of items as opposed to dozens of items in the previous studies. So what he had amongst his items, he had variability in 6 different semantic dimensions. Some of them he called more language-based, so they were things like number of senses that a word has, number of meaning senses that a word has, and average radiance of co-occurrence, or ARC, which was available from a lexical co-occurrence model that Chris Westbury and Cyrus Schall had just published. And then he had what he called object-based semantic variables. So these were things like BOI, as we've just learned about, but also imageability, and then number of features, which comes from the McRae feature listing database. So multiple indexes of semantic richness. And then to try and force some differentiation between variables, he also manipulated time course. So what he did was there were two response tasks. So participants were either making lexical decisions or they were making semantic decisions. And the semantic decisions were, is it a concrete or an abstract word? So pretty basic semantic distinction. And then he had blocked 4 different signal to response windows. So participants either had to respond after 75 milliseconds of seeing the stimulus, 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, or 400 milliseconds. So these are all pretty fast. But what would happen is in the 75 millisecond block, word appears. After 75 milliseconds of seeing the word, a tone comes over the headsets which says, you better respond fast, is basically what participants learned. It's really just it's a tone, but they've been told that's the signal to respond. And then they respond 350 milliseconds later. So they have 350 milliseconds to exercise their response after they hear the tone. So first of all, let me tell you that participants hated this task. I felt like we needed to send them to counseling after they were done because it was so awful. So if you didn't respond in exactly the right time frame, you got a message on the screen either saying that you were too fast or you were too slow. And they had to, of course, listen to hundreds of tones presented over the headset too. So they did not like this task, but they produced some really interesting data. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So these are data for, on the left, you've got the lexical decision task. On the right, the semantic decision task. We know the semantic decision task is going to evoke more extensive semantic processing. So we might see a bit more happening there in terms of our semantic variables. And the semantic variables are all going to compete to explain the limited variability that can be attributed to semantic processing and lexical decision, and the slightly more extensive variability that can be attributed to semantic processing in the semantic decision task. And so I wanted to highlight, first of all, the usual suspects explaining lexical decisions. So this is the variance explained at the initial 75 millisecond time window. None of our variables are explaining anything because it's so fast. There's really, really only very shallow processing that's happened. But then frequency and length start to become important. And the same is true in our semantic decision task. Those things become progressively more influential as processing gets more extensive. And then if you look at the lexical decision, it's only in the final time window that we have some of the semantic variables predicting response latencies. And then within the semantic decision task, you've got more of the variables simultaneously explaining behavior, so that and a bit of a shift, so that some of those more language-based semantic variables have an earlier influence than some of the more object-based semantic variables. And this is in keeping with a framework proposed by, among other people, Larry Barsalou has proposed that in semantic processing, you might have kind of two phases. So the initial phase of meaning information might be more language-focused dimensions, and then object-focused dimensions that require more extensive simulation of sensory-motor information might be a little bit later. And you can kind of see that lag happening in Ian's data set. But for our purposes, what's most important is that you've got simultaneous effects of multiple semantic predictors, only some of which are really embodied predictors. Number of features, for instance, is not really embodied, right? It's things like, it's taxonomic information and it's contextual information and information about particular aspects of a word's meaning. So we do have evidence for differences in time course, and we also have some task differences. As I mentioned, lexical decision, limited semantic processing, semantic decision, a lot more semantic processing. So if we think about that continuum again, we're really somewhere in the middle because we've got multiple aspects of meaning influencing behavior. Okay, so here's an interim summary of what I told you so far. High BOI words tend to be earlier acquired. We saw data to that effect. Words that are high in sensory-motor richness are, in general, processed more efficiently, consistent with those predictions we derived right at the outset. In red, I put some additional findings that I didn't walk you through today, but we also can assume. So we know from other research that if you use fMRI, for instance, to look at the neural correlates of BOI, you generally find that high BOI words tend to selectively recruit areas associated with bodily kinesthetic memory. So left inferior parietal lobule was the area that we found in particular in that 2012 study. We also know so one of the things about BOI is it's a really coarse dimension, right? You're just asking participants about ease of interaction. You don't say much about exactly what the maybe effectors would be that would be involved in that interaction. And so we have done some other work where we really drilled down to figure out, well, what is BOI about? Like, what is the aspect of the BOI dimension that's really driving behavior? And what we found is that it's mostly grasping. So things that you can grasp with your hands are the things that tend to have high BOI ratings and also that tend to facilitate behavior. There are lots of other kinds of, you can have kind of like a full, just sort of proprioceptive motor experience, but that's not really what drives the behavioral effects. It's grasping. And things you can grasp easily, you tend to be able to recognize really easily. We also know from some individual difference work that we've done recently that if you have really good motor imagery skills, you tend to show big BOI effects. So suggesting there might be a shared mechanism between motor imagery and the kind of processing that drives sensory motor effects in language processing. So really interesting mechanistic insights there. Okay, but in general, bodily experience affords richer semantic representations. So even though in a lexical-semantic task, you were doing really shallow, really basic processing, there's evidence in these effects that you are still accessing information about your previous sensory-motor experiences with these concepts, which is kind of amazing. Okay, the thing is, I've only been telling you about concrete words. So all of the studies I've shown you so far involve stimuli that had concrete meanings. And concrete words make up only about half, maybe, of the adult lexicon. So this theory we've been building isn't explaining very much. It's really just explaining part of what you know. The other part is words that have more abstract meanings. And those don't necessarily have sensory motor richness. You can't obviously learn the meaning of, say, infinity through your sensory motor system. So there's got to be a whole lot of other mechanisms involved and some other dimensions of meaning. So that's what we will turn to for this next part of the talk. So just to be clear, I'm talking about the concreteness continuum. We think of it now as a continuum, but historically this has sometimes been considered more of a categorical distinction. And here, these are the traditional definitions of what it is to be a concrete or an abstract meaning. So a concrete meaning is a thing or action that exists in reality and can be experienced directly through one of your senses. An abstract meaning, as traditionally defined, is something that cannot be directly experienced through the senses. So this shouldn't be a very satisfactory definition because this definition is about what these words lack, right? So they just don't have sensory motor information. But I think in the definition, you can see the bias that's existed in psycholinguistics to study concrete things and to consider sensory motor information as somehow particularly special. So what is the stuff of abstract concepts? That's what we will turn to now. Well, we know a little bit about abstract meaning from the acquisition data. So in general, abstract meanings are acquired later than concrete meanings. So this is data from Marta Ponari's study where they tracked age of acquisition for abstract meanings across childhood. And so you can see that before the age of 4, the child has less than 10% of their lexicon involves abstract meanings. There's a few early acquired abstract words, but very few. And then as age goes past, as age increases, there is an increasing proportion of the lexicon that is abstract words. And Marta argued there's a bit of an inflection that happens around 7 or 8 years of age where there's a real uptick in acquisition. So interesting to think about what's happening at age 7 or 8 that might accelerate acquisition of abstract meaning. But that's a separate question we can maybe turn to in the discussion. The main thing is abstract words appear to be hard, right? Because they're later acquired and they tend to accumulate slowly through development. Okay, well, I want to show you some data where we did some early digging into what are the dimensions of meaning for abstract concepts. And so when we first looked at this, we were really testing that idea that abstract meaning maybe it's not sensory motor because it's abstract, but what could it be? And one of the proposals was emotion information. So a lot of abstract terms, particularly early acquired abstract terms, refer to valenced or emotion concepts. So that's a clue. So emotion could be important. Of course, language experience could also be important. So more language-based aspects of meaning might be particularly predictive. So in this study, we had 400 items. 200 were concrete, 200 were abstract. And then we had 2 different versions of the response task. So some participants responded to the concrete words. So they're looking for concrete meanings. The other half of participants responded to the abstract words. So they're looking for abstract meanings. So you either got the decision, is it an abstract thing, or you got the decision, is it a concrete thing? But the stimuli are the same across the 2 groups. And so there are some key semantic variables. There's a lot of variables in the mix, but there are some key semantic variables we're going to be testing for simultaneous effects of. And they are body-object interaction and imageability, which are the two kind of sensory motor dimensions, and then also a dimension we called emotional experience, which is highly correlated with valence, which is the more traditional measure of emotion information. Okay, so as we look at the data, I know this is a lot, so I'm gonna just try and pull out the key things I want you to think about. And so the key findings are in the yellow boxes. The models also included a whole bunch of other things we were controlling for. But the key findings are that for the concrete decisions, responses tended to be facilitated by imageability and BOI, and actually inhibited by emotional experience. And then if you look at the abstract decisions, it was the opposite. So they're actually facilitated by emotional information and inhibited by BOI. So one thing that's an interesting insight here is that as people are asked to make a decision about concreteness, they're tending to focus on certain dimensions. And so their behavior is influenced by those more sensory motor dimensions that define concreteness. And then when we ask people to actually judge, is this an abstract thing? They relied on emotion information, and they actually found that sensory motor information was a hindrance to their decision. So getting some early clues about what might be different about the meanings of abstract and concrete things. Also, some insights about, again, how multidimensional semantic processing is, right? So that you're seeing simultaneous effects of multiple semantic variables on top of the effects of a whole bunch of lexical variables. But it's also clear that processing is very task dependent. So it's the same items, right, in both conditions, that yet people are, by the nature of the decision they have to make, they're shifting their processing quite dramatically. Now, a little more on trying to dig into the stuff of abstract words. So this was not an easy thing to take on. In fact, there is something people call the challenge of abstract concepts, which is just how hard it is to explain how we grasp them, how we acquire them, how we retrieve them. And so at one point, one of my PhD students, Lenka Zratislova, who's actually from Prague, she said, you know what, Penny, I think I just want to ask people about concrete and abstract meanings. And I don't want them to know that that's necessarily what I'm wanting them to do, but I think if I create a game, then I can access some really interesting things about concrete and abstract meaning. So that's what she did. So you've probably played a game like this at some point in your life. She called it the taboo task. What happened was participants signed up in pairs. They didn't know their partner. So they arrived at the lab. There were video cameras set up and microphones, and they sat across from each other in the lab, these two students. And each pair of participants was given a little deck of target words. And so the task was, you had a particular set of target words, your partner had a particular set of target words. You took turns, and you had to get your partner to come up with the target word, although you could never say the target word. So taboo was the target word, and you needed to communicate the meaning without actually using the label. So you could use lots of words, and you could gesture. And people were pretty good at this. I mean, it wasn't easy, but they were pretty good at eventually getting their partner to guess the meaning. I think the average response time was just under 2 minutes. Some of the target words on the cards were concrete words, and some were abstract words. So, for example, crisis was one of our targets, and participants had to get their partner to guess this word without actually saying it. So we learned a lot from transcribing the words that people used and from coding the gestures that people used. And what we found was, in general, for concrete meanings, when people were trying to convey a concrete meaning, they tended to refer in their words to objects and entities, and they tended to gesture, but in really iconic ways. So one of the concrete targets was beverage. And so a lot of participants, we should have anticipated this, but a lot of participants were gesturing as if they were drinking from a cup. So that was an iconic gesture. Abstract meanings, harder to convey, so took a bit longer, slightly less accurate. So for abstract meanings, people in their words tended to reference other people, but also themselves. So lots of self-other language. They also tended to talk about mental states, emotions, desires, or goals. And in their gestures, because they also gestured a lot, some of them were metaphoric gestures. So for instance, one of the abstract targets was loyalty. And a lot of participants gestured as if they had some like invisible object or like a invisible pet beside them that they were stroking. Another was decision. That was another one of our abstract words. And so I think about 40% of participants made something like this gesture. There was also a lot of just beat gesture for the abstract meanings, presumably because there's just so much effort in conveying some of those meanings that people were working hard and they were using beat gestures to facilitate their own fluency. So this study is not necessarily a typical lexical-semantic paradigm, but we had some really interesting insights from it. And I wanted to show you, this is a quote from the discussion section of the paper, and I think it kind of sums up some of the ways that this study became a launch point for everything I'm going to tell you about afterwards. So we were talking about how participants conveyed abstract meaning, and we said participants' descriptions of abstract words unfolded against the background of the self or others, situated in specific contexts. So people would often say things like, okay, you know, when you are trying to get to, so there was always this kind of put a person in a context with a set of mental states. And experiencing internal states such as intentions, beliefs, emotions, and motivations. So here, I like this quote because I think it captures a number of the clues that we took from this paper. So there's a lot of reference to the self, to others, and so social information seems to be particularly important. Cognition, mental states, beliefs, those are also being referenced. Emotion information, and finally, motivation. So these were 4 aspects of the ways people were conveying abstract meaning that potentially could be some of the stuff of abstract meaning. And we wanted to dig into those, but in more typical lexical semantic ways. And that's what I'm going to tell you about next. So to do it, we really needed a semantic decision mega study because lexical decision is great. And we have lots of lexical decision data for thousands of people and thousands of items. But as I said, when you're interested in semantics, it's really limited. And so eventually was convinced by mostly Melvin Yap that that the world needed a semantic decision mega study and that it was my responsibility to do it. And so I did. And so that's where the data come from many of the final analyses I'm going to show you today. So to do this mega study, semantic decision mega study, which by today's standards doesn't even feel like a mega study anymore, but at the time it felt really mega. So there are concreteness ratings, as you know, as we heard about in the introduction today. Mark Brisbert's concreteness ratings were really one of the first examples of a really big set of word meaning norms. And he collected them for concreteness along with his colleagues. And so when people made those ratings, they were asked to rate how concrete the meaning of a word was on a 5-point scale. And the results are really reliable. You have words like prevail, which tend to be more on the abstract end of the scale. And you have words like bus that are really high in concreteness. And so in deciding how to do our semantic decision mega study, the concrete abstract distinction was one I figured we needed to lean into because every word falls somewhere on this continuum. So we were going to be able to have a lot of items. The other advantage of the concrete abstract distinction is that it's pretty general, right? Because you could make semantic decisions that were like, is it a vegetable? Or is it a vehicle? And so those are very specific semantic categories. And the problem with them is not many words fall into them. And so the processing that people are going to do in order to make a decision about whether something's a vegetable is going to be very specific. They're going to be isolating and focusing on particular dimensions of meaning. And we wanted something that would be higher level than that in terms of the kind of semantic processing. So we took for our semantic decision task the items that fall towards the end of the original Brisbert ratings. Those became the stimuli for our study. So the gist of the methodology, this is before COVID, and we actually brought each of these people to the lab when I was at the University of Calgary. And we had standards we set in terms of accuracy that we wanted from them. We also gave them a few other individual difference measures. So there's vocabulary testing for all these participants, which is in the data set. And we've used that in some interesting ways. And so the final data set are 5,000 concrete words and 5,000 abstract words. We actually divided them into 10 lists because we found that most participants couldn't make more than 1,000 decisions. So that was where we capped it. And again, the decision was, is it a concrete or an abstract word? And they had some instructions setting the stage for that decision, which really came straight from the Brisbane ratings in terms of how they defined concreteness and abstractness. So here are some examples of ways that, because this is a mega study, we can dig into questions that had been much debated leading up to that. So as I said, we're in this final phase of the talk. I'm going to talk about some of those candidate dimensions for abstractness: emotion, socialness, cognition, motivation. Emotion first. So there had been quite a bit of work on the effects of emotion in lexical-semantic processing. There's a lot of work on the effects of emotion in memory. They tend to look at valence and arousal as the key dimensions. Valence in particular is the one that explains more variance in lexical processing. And there had been a real debate because some studies had found that if you look at valence, a valence is typically a 9-point scale with negative on the low end, neutral in the middle, positive high. So what had typically been debated was some studies with small samples, usually between item comparisons matched across word sets. Some studies had found positive facilitation. So words that have more positive meanings tend to be responded to more quickly and more accurately. That was one pattern, and the negative words more slowly. The other pattern, though, was more of a U-shaped curve. So people were finding that you had facilitated processing for both negative and positive meanings relative to neutral, which was a bit slower. So both patterns had been found. And what I thought was really interesting, and one of the first ways we used the semantic decision megastudy data was to say, is this really a story about concreteness? And so what we did is look at concrete responses and how those are related to valence, abstract responses, and look how those are related to valence. And that's what's depicted here. And there's thousands of items in the analysis, and the lowest lines are not necessarily pretty, but take my word for it that when we talk about abstract meaning, the relationship of response time to valence is more of a U shape. So you've got for abstract meanings, negative and positive are both faster than neutral. Whereas for concrete meanings, you find that other pattern where it's positive faster than neutral, faster than negative. So interesting that because we've got a lot of data now, and of course with the models, we can control for all kinds of other variables that might be important, like frequency. You can find both patterns essentially as a function of concreteness. But for our purposes today, what we care about is, does it look like emotion might be an important dimension of abstract meaning? Yes, because processing is facilitated for positive meanings and for negative meanings versus neutral meanings. So there's an advantage when an abstract meaning has valence associated with it, suggesting that valence might be an important dimension of abstract meaning. Okay, what about socialness? Well, to do an analysis of how socialness is related to lexical-semantic processing, we needed to collect some norms. And so Veronica Devika and I, working with Richard Binney, dug into this question of how is socialness related to lexical-semantic processing? And it actually took us on quite a journey through a couple of interesting literatures. Because within psycholinguistics, there had started to be the suggestion that as we think hard about the challenge of abstract concepts, social information might be particularly important to abstract meanings. That was one of the proposals, and you could trace it to, for instance, Anna Borghi's writing often makes that point. So social relevance might be important. We also, though, Richard and Veronica work more in neuropsychology, and they were coming at this question from their experience in the neuropsychological literature, which is where there's a lot of discussion about the social brain and about social salience in neuropsychological findings and neuroimaging findings. So, for instance, there has been in multiple studies the finding that social stimuli, sometimes those are words, not always, social stimuli tend to have more selective processing in the dorsolateral anterior temporal lobe than non-social stimuli. And also this general notion that social is salient or special in terms of neuropsychological processing. But as a psycholinguist, when I looked at that literature, what was striking to me is that many of those studies where they looked at socialness in the brain had defined socialness based on experimenter intuitions or participant ratings, but for a very small set of items. So not much consensus in definition of what it is to be a social concept, and very limited stimuli and limited selection of stimuli. So we needed some norms to dig into this question of whether social is special and whether that's particularly true for abstract concepts. So to do that, we quantified socialness in a recent norms paper. We decided to have a really broad definition. So we said social relevance could be about a social organization, social institution, social role. So we were casting a really broad net, but we thought, well, let's do that. And if we get reliable ratings, more the better, then that suggests people can hold this broad concept in mind and that it's meaningful. And indeed, that's what we found. So despite how broad our definition was, we found reliable ratings where participants said words like custard have very low socialness ratings, and words like family have very high socialness ratings. And then, importantly, looked for effects in behavior. And so this is, I'm summing up here a lot of behavioral explorations of socialness effects. We are looking at some mega-study data, so we're relying on some other mega-studies to look at the effects of socialness. So word or non-word, the first two panels on the left side are about lexical decision, and the check mark means, yes, there's an effect of socialness in terms of lexical decision behavior, even when you control for all the other stuff that should influence lexical decision-making. And there are now not just visual lexical decision megastudies, but auditory lexical decision megastudies with various accents. So remarkably rich opportunities to explore the effects of some of these variables. We also looked using the Calgary Semantic Decision Project. We looked at semantic decision making, which is the third and fourth panels as you work your way across. And you can see that, interestingly, there's a facilitatory effect of socialness on concrete decisions, but not on abstract decisions, despite the prediction that socialness might be particularly important for abstract meaning. We're not finding support for that in those data. There's also recognition memory megastudies, and so we looked at whether there's an effect of socialness in those decisions about whether a word has been seen before, and indeed there is. So there's facilitated or more accurate memory for concepts that are more social. And then finally, we did a syntactic classification task ourselves with a factorial manipulation of socialness and concreteness, and found some evidence for socialness effect, little evidence that it interacted with concreteness. So, to the question of, can we define socialness in a really broad way and get meaningful ratings? Yes, we can. And it does seem to influence behavior, although not in the way that Anna Borghi would have predicted. So we're not finding evidence that it's particularly influential for abstract meanings. Socialness seems to be it's influential, but it's broader than just abstract concepts. What about motivation? So this is the next variable, the second to last variable I'm going to tell you about today before we put it all together. So this is, we're calling it motivation. It's certainly an aspect of reward processing. This is work that Irina is here today. This is work that she led, and she has a poster tomorrow where she looks at neuroimaging data with the motivation dimension, but also with socialness at 4 something. So check that out tomorrow. So we wanted to have some norms, anticipating we would want to do some neuroimaging studies and other behavioral studies. We wanted to have some norms for motivation. So to me, this was really interesting because when I started doing lexical-semantic processing work decades ago, people weren't really talking, certainly they weren't talking much about semantic influences and sensory motor influences, and they definitely weren't talking about reward in the context of lexical processing. But we had reason to believe that it might matter and would reflect some really interesting processing as people are doing these very basic lexical-semantic tasks. They are nonetheless thinking hard about lots of different aspects of word meaning. And so wanted to test whether motivation might be one of those. So to be clear, what we are looking at is the extent to which meanings were related to motivation. So chocolate is not going to be the word that gets the highest ratings. I know that chocolate is very motivating, as are other things associated with reward. But we were asking a slightly different question because some of the variability that is about the meaningfulness of chocolate had already been captured by things like valence and arousal. So we define this as a sense of desire to achieve or obtain a goal, regardless of whether positive or negative. So really trying to get at that aspect, which is, that this is this will drive behavior, right? So this is a concept that is about behavioral drive. And so I'm giving you some examples here of the kinds of ratings we got. And of course, these are, we've been very careful in doing these norms studies to make sure we are selecting items that have high overlap with other data sets and with behavioral megastudies as well. These are like the other studies, open. These are open. The norms are open and available for download. And so although I'm giving you this brief piece of the instructions, take my word for it, the participants get extensive training and much longer instructions in the actual study. But nonetheless, these are some of the ratings you get. So aspiration or ambition are two of the highest rated words in these motivation norms. But again, nice to know that you can quantify this, should be useful for others who want to study this aspect of meaning. Most importantly, does it matter for behavior? So because we've been choosing items that have high overlap with other mega studies, we have pretty good sample sizes in each of these analyses. So what we've got on the left side is lexical decision task and also the word knowledge task from the English crowdsourcing project. And then on the right, we've got semantic decisions from the Calgary Semantic Decision Project. On the top panel, the responses for concrete words. On the bottom panel, the responses for abstract words. And so there's a lot here because we do have a lot of variables in the model. So we're showing you that, first of all, we put in the model those things we know matter for lexical-semantic processing, which is length and frequency and age of acquisition. But then we dig into some simultaneous semantic effects. And you can see that there's some task variability. So the different predictors move further away from that center line depending on the task and their congruency with the task. But in general, what we're seeing is that motivation does have an incremental effect alongside these other semantic predictors. It's the general takeaway. So yes, motivation influences behavior as collected in ARENA's ratings. And yes, particularly for abstract words. So in the Calgary Semantic Decision Task Analysis, the effect of motivation was present for abstract decisions, but not for concrete decisions. So evidence that this might be one of the dimensions that is the stuff of abstract words. Okay, last dimension, last new dimension that I'm going to introduce to you today. If you think about what participants were saying in Lenka's study with the taboo task, they were talking a lot about mental states and beliefs. And one of the proposals about abstract meaning is that it is in part about introspection, and that introspection and internal states, not just in terms of emotion, but also in terms of cognitive states, might be important to abstract meaning. And so we wanted to try and dig into that idea. So to do it, we needed norms for cognition. So we asked participants about cognitive relevance instead of social relevance, and we gave them a definition of what cognitive relevance would mean and the kind of states that we were, or actions that we were trying to probe. And so, again, very highly overlapping set of items with the previous studies to allow congruent analyses. And here are the kinds of ratings we got. So cactus has very low cognition, but belief is one of the highest items in our norms. So in terms of behavior, I've collapsed 4 tasks into this figure. And so as a result, I'm not sure it's super effective. But as before, you can see that we put in length and frequency and And these are the data for lexical decision, but also for semantic decisions for the same items. And the takeaway is that there is a cognition effect, although I realize it's very hard to see. There is a cognition effect. So responses are facilitated and they are in terms of reaction time, but they're also more accurate when words have more cognitive relevance, everything else being controlled through statistical analyses. And that is true in particular for abstract decisions and more for abstract decisions than for concrete decisions. So just to summarize, we do have a cognition effect in behavior. Behavior is facilitated when words have cognitive relevance or relevant to mental states and actions. And yes, particularly for abstract words. So another clue about what it is that abstract meaning comprises. Now, I realize I've told you about a lot of variables today. And so what I want to do in this final section is to bring some of it together and put it all in the same pot and say, okay, if you have all of these predictors, what does the overall semantic space look like? So how does this all fit together? How do these things land? Is cognition different than motivation? Is socialness different than valence? Are they incremental or not? So I have a factor analysis I want to show you, and then some network analyses. So we are factor analyzing semantic space. And what that means is we're taking these items that overlap across all of these norms and behavioral mega studies, and there's about 7,500 of those items. And we're going to include in the mix some measures of sensory motor experience. Now we're moving beyond BOI. I'm happy to say that there are the Lancaster norms, for example, from Lynott and Connell, where they actually broke down, because remember I said BOI is a pretty coarse measure of sensory motor experience. And so these are much more precise. They break down different kinds of action, whether it's haptic or interoceptive, for example. So across the senses, across the modalities, you have different measures of action. And then also perception. So you have foot and leg action, but then you also have interoceptive sense. So there are multiple dimensions here, which are all capturing different aspects across different effectors and across whether it's an action or a sensation, sensory motor experience. And then we've also got some measures of emotional experience.
So valence, as I told you, is always a big deal. Valence extremity tends to be, so that basically just says, it doesn't matter whether it's positive or negative, it's just deviation from neutral. And that tends to explain more variance than valence itself. Also arousal and dominance, which is the power differential. It can also be part of what emotional experience is. And then these new ones that I've shown you today, socialness, motivation, cognition. And then we also had some measures of that language-based meaning from things like semantic diversity, and ANS is average neighborhood size, is a lexical co-occurrence density metric from the lexical co-occurrence model. So we're going to put all that in the soup and see what we get in terms of is there a meaningful factor structure and how do those fit together. So if you take all those words and you just go for, okay, what is the most inclusive model that we will tolerate, even when you've got some complex loadings and some questionable communalities. Here I'm being very inclusive with this model. I'll show you some less inclusive models in a second. So you get a 6-factor solution. This is we have complete data for about 6,300 items.
Interestingly, the first dimension is motivated cognition. And yet this is all the items. Like half of them are concrete. They're not all abstract. So motivated cognition is coming through as the first factor in this analysis. Some other things we were curious about, where does socialness land? Is it sitting with valence or is it somewhere else? Well, as you can see, socialness, which is up at the top there, is actually, we had a dimension we called social interaction, where you're getting some other aspects which are about verbal communication, really. And that's where socialness is. You can see some interesting distinctions across effectors when it comes to the tactile or haptic modality. So some sense that hands might be a little different than the rest of the body in terms of perception, back to that point I made earlier about the primacy of grasping for sensory motor experience. Okay, so this is when you put everything together. But I've been talking a lot today about abstract meaning and concrete meaning and how that's an important distinction. So the next model I want to show you is, well, first of all, let me talk about this distinction a little bit. So these are, for the full data set, this is just a bit of descriptive information about how all those variables compare or contrast across the concrete abstract distinction. So this is kind of telling you what is diagnostic of abstract meaning versus concrete meaning. So the big differences, as you can see across the top, cognition. So abstract meanings have a lot more cognitive relevance. Abstract meanings also have a lot more interoceptive sense. They are higher in motivation. They're higher in socialness, but socialness is an interesting case because socialness is higher for abstract meaning than concrete, but socialness actually structures concrete semantic space more than it does abstract semantic space. So some interesting differences there. And then visual information, of course, is quite different as well. So you've got a lot more visual information associated with concrete concepts than abstract. Now, what does this look like if you factor analyze concrete semantic space? So here I am being more stringent. So if something had low communalities, I took it out of the mix. So that led to the exclusion of head, action, valence extremity, dominance, semantic diversity, and average neighborhood size. So all those things dropped out. And now the factors are a little bit different. The solution is different when you take just those concrete meanings. If we look at just the abstract meanings, which was really our focus for the latter part of the talk, what was really surprising to me was the first factor, because these are abstract meanings. And yet, much of their structure is aligning with things that we think of as being sensory motor. So interesting insights there about how perhaps abstract meanings are not, it's unfair to say they are devoid of sensory motor meaning, but it has different relevance. Okay, last data I'd like to show you are from a paper that came out last year. At the time, we didn't yet have motivation and cognition ratings. But what we wanted to do was to say, what is the interrelationship? What is the network structure within concrete concepts? What is the network structure within abstract concepts? This is enabled because we have so many data points now with so many variables. And some interesting things came through in these analyses. So there's a lot that's the same. So I don't want you to leave the talk today thinking that there are massive differences between concrete and abstract concepts. There's a lot of overlap in what structures semantic space, but there are some differences. So when you look at centrality, the most central variable in the organization and the network structure of concrete meanings is haptic information. Whereas for abstract meanings, the most central organizing variables are interoception and mouth action. And so the mouth action one is really interesting. Anna Borgi would take that quite literally and really feels like mouth movement and its relationship to inner speech are particularly important for abstract meaning. I'm not sure I'm prepared to go there, but I do think that communicative behavior is very important for abstract meaning and that's partly what we're seeing there. So really big differences. Another difference is that if you want to predict, if we just have one glance back to the acquisition point where we started today, the best predictor of acquisition for concrete words is sensory motor. So it's going to be haptic and it's going to be visual. Those are what drive acquisition, predicting acquisition for concrete meanings. Predicting acquisition for abstract meanings, it's going to be more affective. So it's going to be emotion and it's going to be a little bit of introspection. That's what drives or best predicts acquisition for abstract meanings. All right, so final takeaway messages from me. I think if you harken back to that framework I started with and the continuum of embodiment, we need to be somewhere in the middle. And we need to be a place in the middle that allows multiple representations of meaning. So you need to have dimensions of meaning that include sensory motor information for sure, but you also need linguistic experience, social, different dimensions of interoceptive information. Those all seem to be relevant. And the relative importance of each dimension varies by concept. So you have different, so the abstract concrete distinction would be an important piece of mapping that difference across concepts. But it's not like a whole hog, throw the dimensions away and bring in some new ones. It's more about relative importance and interrelationships between the dimensions. So I think we are safely in the middle of this continuum, and if you want to move forward with an understanding of where I think we should be in theoretical space, it's somewhere in that weak embodiment, which is almost an unfortunate label. It's somewhere in the weak embodiment space, particularly the multiple representation series. And I think without mega studies and big data in psycholinguistics, we wouldn't yet be there. So I think those data have enabled some really interesting insights about where we sit in the continuum of embodiment and what that means for lexical-semantic space. So thank you for your attention today, and thanks to my fabulous collaborators. So yeah, happy to take any question.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. We have a few minutes for discussion. Please use the mics. We have 2 assistants here who will bring you the mic. So if you raise your hand, you'll get the mic and then you can start asking.
Oh, thanks for your presentation. It was great. I'm wondering if you were thinking about taking this not in the direction of differences between modalities or between types of concepts, but between people. So let's say abstract concepts may be represented by more of effective content and less of specific body content. You may need also more or stronger network of lexical and conceptual connections. But if you have, well, or to me, one of the possible interpretations is that if people who don't just have such a dense network of lexical and conceptual connections should have relatively more effective content in the abstract representation. So have you been thinking along these sorts of lines?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that's a fabulous question. And I mentioned that we had done a little bit of work initially looking at individual differences in motor imagery and whether that mapped to BOI effect size, and it does. We've replicated that a couple of times now. But on the abstract side, I think there's huge potential for looking at those individual differences. So Hannah Kornblum, who's just starting her doctorate, finished her master's thesis, was essentially looking at individual differences in mentalizing ability and how those are related to the cognition effect. And indeed found that participants who had stronger mentalizing skills, and it's interesting too, because I feel like the measurement of that dimension is not yet psychometrically strong. So there's some room to measure it more extensively. It's related to theory of mind, but the idea is that even in a neurotypical adult population, you could find individual variability in mentalizing skill. Some people are really good at making inferences about other people's mental states, and some less motivated to do that. And so that difference seems to map to the extent to which people show a cognition effect. So what that suggests to me is, as we think about this variability across tasks and across concepts, there's also huge variability as a function of individual differences. And I think ways that are super interesting because they allow additional theoretical insights. So I think it's, the frameworks would absolutely, the multiple representation view expects task differences. It expects differences across concepts. It also predicts individual differences. And I think the literature is just starting to dig into that. And And so I think this is going to be a fruitful area for further study. I also really love that individual differences might have been elevated to the point where they are allowing theoretical insights, because I feel like for so long individual differences has kind of been this like, backwater of cognitive psychology. So it's great to see it fronted with real kind of theoretical heft. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another question.
Thank you for your amazing presentation. Thank you for all the data that you have been using for the last 10 years. So yeah, very nice to see all this literature. Thank you very much. So just to try to link in all these ideas with lexical processing and semantic representation, I'd like to know if you can go a step further or 2 steps further and relink and try to put your kind of results, all these dimensions in models of lexical processing, lexical representation, pretty much in the field of psycholinguistics. But if you go 2 steps further, if you can link this to more theoretical theories of semantic representation and semantics in linguistics.
Yeah. So great question. A really big one. So yeah, I have today limited the theoretical space to the theories that have something to say about sensory motor processing and whether there's grounding in sensory motor information. And there are a number of ways that could be captured in various models. I think one of the most exciting pieces in terms of theoretical development is around predictive processing. So it's very interesting to think about most of the effects I've shown you today are effects that arise when you look at single word processing. And things are very different as soon as there is more linguistic context and people are able to derive predictions. I mean, the task demands that the effects we see where we see big differences across tasks, those are about predictive processing and about people deciding, okay, my task is to decide if something's concrete. I am anticipating the kinds of information that are going to be important to this decision, and those are going to become more salient in my responses. So I think the next step in terms of affording real theoretical advances will be working with context and looking at the effects. And you need a great deal of sensitivity, I think, to be able to detect those effects. But with many items, we have, I think, additional possibilities for sensitivity to figure out how does the semantic richness get modulated by context, and what does that mean in terms of fitting for different theoretical possibilities.
Right. Thank you very much. I think our time is up and it's time for a coffee break. So thank you again for a wonderful lecture.